Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining our webinar today. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Lucy Ritchie, Senior Client Manager for Energy and Utility Skills, and I'll be chairing today's webinar aimed at beginning to prepare training providers and assessment centres for this exciting development in the evolution of the gas industry, the transition to hydrogen. So before we make a start, can I just run through some general housekeeping? Please, can I ask you to keep your microphones and cameras turned off? I'd really encourage you to ask questions, so please feel free to post any questions in the chat function, and we will address these as part of the Q&A session later on. Today's webinar is being recorded, and the recording will be made available to everybody that has registered afterwards. We are intending to run a second webinar in March, so your questions will also be used to shape the agenda for this second webinar. And today I'm joined by my colleagues Phil Burnett and Richard Harper. Next slide, please, Vicky. So the aim of today's session is to update training providers and assessment centres on work being carried out to develop and implement a hydrogen competence framework for existing gas safe registered engineers, what that will mean for them and how they may become more involved at the appropriate time for their business. Next slide, please, Vicky. So hopefully today's webinar's objectives are, by the end of today's session, you will be able to describe the structure and components of the hydrogen competence framework, explain the process to be used for the training and assessment of engineers, state the engineer hydrogen training entry criteria, principles to be used, and to identify the training, assessment and certification requirements needed for the initial neighbourhood trial, and identify the centre requirements needed for participation in the training and or assessment of engineers in the short and medium term. Next slide, please, Vicky. So before we get into the session, it's important to set the scene and to try and contextualise the work that we're currently doing against the backdrop of government policy. So obviously you can see from the slide here that there's a huge policy drive towards a shift away from the use of high carbon fuels and the target of net zero emissions by 2050. So there's obviously a move to replace natural gas with hydrogen, and has been a subject of significant research. And we're now moving towards the first community trials, where new mains, services and appliances will be installed in customers' premises. And it looks like the first neighbourhood trial is being scheduled for spring 2023, which is going to be taking place in Fife, which is part of the SGN network. So I think it was important really to try and sort of set the scene. There's obviously a lot of talk around net zero and hydrogen, more so from a sort of government policy perspective, and obviously all the feasibility trials that are currently going on. But clearly the aim of today, and certainly the work that Energy and Utility Skills has been commissioned to do by BEIS, is all around skills, competence, training, that engineering workforce of the future. And at this point, I will hand over to my colleague Phil Burnett.
Yes, hi everyone. That's it. Thanks, Vicky. Yeah, so the hydrogen competence framework, then it's a fine sounding title. What does it mean? It basically is to ensure that anybody who carries out work in customers' premises at this stage, there will obviously need to be training and competence assessment of distribution people and even transmission people as we move forward in the hydrogen world. But this project that BEIS commissioned Energy Utility Skills to do was looking at engineers who work downstream of the emergency control valve. So that's what this webinar is really concentrating on. So in order to develop a competence framework, which is going to make sure that people are properly trained, properly assessed, and indeed registered on Gas Safe Register for hydrogen competence as well as for natural gas. We started, the work started with a comparative analysis of the hydrogen as opposed to natural gas. Like, what are the differences in the properties, characteristics of the gases, and how does that impact on what gas safe registered engineers do? The hypothesis when we started that work, and this was completed in 2021, was that there would be few new skills required. Most of the skills that people would need would be the same, with the more exception probably of some different equipment for analysing the gas and different gas detection equipment. But mainly the skills requirements would be broadly similar or the same, but there would be significant knowledge and understanding requirements that people would need to develop and demonstrate that they understood, because the gas is a completely different gas. It's not a hydrocarbon like natural gas, methane, propane, butane, etc. It's completely separate to that, and it therefore has different characteristics. And so following that comparative analysis, which identified those differences and what they meant, we then moved on to map that into a skills matrix, which identified, well, what new skills are required and what new knowledge is required. And that in turn led to a training specification, which is basically what do people entering this hydrogen world need to be trained to do? What new knowledge do they need? What new understanding do they need, etc.? And so the training specification, it's in draft form at the moment, because there is still some work going on to fill some gaps in research as to particular work practices that might need to be changed or may not need to be changed, particularly in the area of purging, for example, is a good one. So the training specification, once it's signed off and finished, which will be later on this year, will enable training providers in the future to develop a course, a training course that meets that specification. And similarly, there's an assessment module which will be an ACS module, accredited certification scheme module for hydrogen, which will enable people who've been through that training to then be formally independently assessed like other ACS modules, and having passed that assessment, then be registered in a new category on the Gas Safe Register that recognises their competence in hydrogen. So that in the shell of a nut is the hydrogen competence framework. Next slide, please, Vicky. Okay, so we move on really to the training provider's responsibilities. Once all those documents and those frameworks are ready, what will training providers need to be doing? Well, as I've already mentioned, they will be able to develop a hydrogen training course that meets the competence framework specification. So the initial training provider, I'll come on to that in the short term in a few minutes, but the initial training providers will need some assistance with that, obviously, because this is it's new. There aren't many people across the UK who have the expertise already to develop training materials and deliver training materials, and that's fully recognised. And so the early providers will need some assistance in that, but they will be able to develop a course. That course will then need to be recognised as being as meeting the requirements of the IGEM IG1 standards of training in gas work. Relatively new standard for training, which applies now to all gas entry training courses, and make sure that the duration of any course is appropriate, that the content is appropriate, that the proper experience and all that has gone on and meets all the criteria within the specification and also the IGEM standards for training work. Again, that's a process that's it is in use now. It's been operating now for about 4 or 5 years, I guess, and the intention is, as it has been all through the development of this framework, to use the existing governance procedures that exist within the industry, so that when this is scaled up and it becomes, if all things go well, it becomes a national conversion program almost, then we can scale all these things up so many more providers can get involved, many more engineers can go through the training and assessment and be registered, etc., etc. So we started in that way, and that's the intention to expand that over time as we need to. So what training providers also need to do, of course, is identify who's going to do the training, because again, we're starting with very few people who would be classed as hydrogen trainers. You could count on the fingers of less than one hand. But those trainers will obviously themselves need to go through the program, make sure that they understand and have the necessary capability in terms of training and assessment on hydrogen, to be able to impart that knowledge and teach people who are coming through, who all will be experienced gas safe registered natural gas engineers in the first instance. But obviously, as the thing rolls out in years to come, that will expand, and people will come into a world where natural gas is being phased out and hydrogen is being increased. So over time, in the longer term, the apprenticeships, etc., will all shift towards teaching people how to install, maintain, and deal with hydrogen installations and appliances rather than natural gas ones. But we are, as the slide, as this webinar indicates at the start, we are in a transition. So we're starting at a small base, and then we'll scale up over time as the need sort of comes necessary. So the final thing, it's a fairly obvious one. These are short bullet points that contain a lot of work that needs to be done. Fully recognise that training facilities will need to be extended and amended so that they have the necessary supply of hydrogen. May well have to be a bottled supply in the first instance, depending on where the providers are. There may not be a piped hydrogen supply available. So bottled gas initially, but new metering, hydrogen meters are already being developed and in fact are already available. Contracts were let by BEIS for metering, construction people to build the meters for hydrogen. A number of appliances are already available and ready to go for hydrogen. In fact, central heating boilers have been installed in the HSE's Spade Adam location in Cumbria and have been operational now for probably more than 9 months. So by the time they're ready to go into consumers' properties, they'll be well tested, and they've obviously been researched to death. So we know they're all safe and they work okay and all that. But obviously training providers will need to have those facilities in order to train people. So no surprise there. Okay, next slide, please, Vicky. Okay, so yeah, this is very similar, the assessment centres, because obviously this will be, I mentioned it will be an independent assessment. So we know that in a number of gas training centres now, there's also a separate part of that centre or a separate building joined to and all of that, but a separation between training and assessment. The assessment will, in similar way to existing ACS, the model, it will have to be an independent assessment. And similarly, the ACS centre will need to develop an ACS module that meets the competence framework specification. So again, all the requirements will be set out in a specification. So the matters of gas safety which this is really all about matters of gas safety, because it's a changeover really to a different gas rather than to a different category of work. So they'll be able to produce an ACS module. They'll need obviously a certification body, because in the same way that the current ACS for all the other modules, HTR1, CKR1, CENWAT, the ACS modules, etc., they are all certificated by one of, I think, the 7 different nominated gas certification bodies, all recognised by UCAS, a UK accreditation service, and all have a contract, an agreement, an arrangement with Gas Safe Register to upload successful engineers who've passed that assessment. They can upload that data to Gas Safe Register. So there will need to be at least one, over time more than one, no doubt, but there'll need to be gas certification body able to operate in conjunction with the ACS centre or centres as we move forward, to be able to carry that task out for hydrogen. And similar to training providers, assessment centres will need to identify which of their assessors they want to be able to carry out the hydrogen assessment. That's a mistake on that slide with me. So take its hydrogen assessment to extend the capability to assess engineers, and they will have to they'll have to take that training. It's not a mistake, it's my mistake, sorry. They'll have to go through the training program themselves in order to be competent to carry out the assessments, which is what it said. Okay. And then similarly to providers, again, they'll need to ensure that their assessment facility has the necessary supply and appliances and equipment required to be able to carry out those assessments to meet the specification. So there's quite a lot to do, as you can see there, which is why we're starting these set of webinars a good more than 12 months ahead of any trial that is planned for the first trial, which is called the neighbourhood trial. Next slide, please, Vicky. Okay, so then Lucy mentioned the neighbourhood trial. That's the first one. That's about 400 properties, they're domestic properties, and so it's necessary for us to determine, well, who will be eligible to add hydrogen skills and competence to their existing portfolio, if you like. So we have been working and have developed, been to consultation on it, a set of criteria that people must already have in order to go through this competence framework for hydrogen. So you can see on the screen there that the gas safe registered engineers must hold certain specific domestic categories, and they're the common ones: CENWAT, cookers, fires, that sort of thing. Or there is a possibility for people who just do emergency service work, FCOs, then they must hold the appropriate ones for them. But an important point in the middle bullet point there, that any gas safe register will only be able to work within the same categories that they already hold for natural gas. So if you're an FCO on natural gas and you go through the hydrogen program, then you will be an FCO who can also carry out that work with hydrogen installations. It won't mean that you can go and install appliances, or you can go and do work in other categories. So it's very important that people understand that, you know, that the categories will remain as they are. So if you come in with whatever you come in with on natural gas, then what you'll be able to do is those exact same things, but for hydrogen, 100% hydrogen we're talking about now, not blended, because that's a different cup of tea. That doesn't require this extra training and all that. And they must have been gas safe registered in the natural gas categories that they hold for at least 12 months. There was some debate about the length of time of experience required, if you like. but it was felt that we should align that to, there's been a revision fairly recently on Guidance Note 8, for those who are familiar with Guidance Note 8, and that talks about people having 12 months experience in one category before they're able to add a different category. So it's sensible, we think, to align that to the same sort of period of time, and which reinforces what I said earlier about we want to use a model that is tried and tested and can be scaled up as we expand and go forward, if you like. So yeah, next slide, please, Vicky. So yeah, so we get into more to the sort of trial requirements, that be about 40 engineers, we think. We don't know exactly the number. It doesn't really matter whether it's 40, 45, 50, but it's approximately 40 engineers. It'll be around about 300 domestic premises. Now, these people who are the consumers it will be a voluntary trial, as we understand it. SGN are working on the planning for the trial, which is in Fife, as Lucy said, and people will be able to opt in to this trial. And if they opt in, then they will get a new supply, basically. They won't be repurposing the existing main, service, meter, or appliances. They'll all be replaced. It'll all be new, new network, new installation. Now, because of the numbers, and we're starting, as I said earlier, with a low base. You know, there's one trial, there's 40 engineers. It's not a commercial market at this stage. There's not hundreds of engineers in a queue wanting training on hydrogen. Well, there may be a queue, but it's a quite a long wait before it opens, if you like. So there may only need to be one training provider to train the 40 engineers plus the trainers, etc., etc. in the first instance. And I must stress that's in the first instance. There'll clearly need to be more than one training provider and one assessment centre as we roll out. But you know, where do you start when you've got none? Well, you start with the first one. So the likelihood is, the high likelihood is that that training centre will need to be relatively close to the trial area, simply because the engineers who are selected and who meet the criteria and who are going forward to take the first hydrogen training programs are likely to live close to the trial area as well, live and work there, because it wouldn't really make sense to hold the provision in Plymouth when you're running the trial in Scotland. So basically it's all about the geography at the start. There will, however, need to be a certification body, as I already mentioned, and it's not restricted to one provider, but the logistics and the costs and the planning and all of that probably mean, in all reality, that there will be one training provider who starts the thing off, and then as we move forward, those requirements will expand. You can see on the right hand side of that slide, it's not that far away from, if you start the neighbourhood trial in 2023, that will obviously take some time to complete, to install all those things. Then there'll be what a trial obviously is, to see how it goes, lessons learned, etc. How what went well, what didn't go so well, what do we need to change. That's not that long after that we start, or the planning starts to roll out the village trial, which is 1,000+ properties. We don't know exactly where this is going to be yet. Probably the people who are planning it do, but we don't. Doesn't really matter where it is as far as the skills and competencies go. But importantly, because it's a larger geographical area, 1,000 properties, etc., it will include some non-domestic appliances. So therefore, we will need to amend the entry criteria to enable existing non-domestic gas safe registered engineers also to get their capability extended to include hydrogen. So the first entry criteria is purely for the 2023 neighbourhood trial. It will need to expand to incorporate the requirements for 2025 village trial, which will also involve repurposing networks. So using the existing installation materials, etc. Research is still underway for the range and list of materials that will be acceptable for use on hydrogen. There are some obvious ones that will be acceptable, like copper pipe and soldered fittings. That's already been classed as being fine. There are other materials, though, as we all know, that are sometimes used and have been used in the past, going right back in the day to lead piping and all that. I suppose there's much of that around now, but there's bound to be some somewhere. Lead meter connections and stuff, if they haven't been replaced, they may not have been. So there will be a definitive list in all, at some point in time. We don't have a definitive list at the moment, but by 2025 village trial, there will need to be a list of materials, pipe work, of connections, fittings, etc., that will be acceptable for use with hydrogen. The reason that some things might not be is all to do with the properties and characteristics of the gas, because it is a lot lighter gas. It's a lot less dense. It can leak through holes that are much smaller, if you like, to put it in layman's terms, which is always good for me. So we do intend, however, to use the same model for training and assessment, although the specification and assessment modules will need to evolve along with the criteria to incorporate non-domestic training, non-domestic assessment, as well as domestic. So it's all going to move along with an evolutionary sort of development, so that we add what we need to add, and until eventually, of course, if you roll the clock forward maybe 10 or 15 years, and if we do go to a full hydrogen model, then eventually all training and everybody on the gas safe register will need to go through hydrogen training in order to be competent and safe to work with all the categories, even the specialist categories, like swimming pools and fish fryers and all sorts. So along with that, there's 130,000 people on the gas safe register. Eventually, you could imagine that all 130,000 of those people will need to be trained on hydrogen and assessed as competent to work with hydrogen, and that will necessitate, quite obviously, expansion of a number of training providers and assessment centres able to deliver those requirements. And that then is when we do move into a commercial market. So any sort of setup that's done then will be back to almost like business as usual, if you like. So that's where we are with that. So facilities and gas supply and appliances and trainers be required for all of that, really. Okay, next slide, please, Vicky. I think that might be me handing back to you, Lucy.
Well, thank you, Phil, for that whistle-stop tour.
Whistle stop.
I think for the first time in living memory, you've actually not gone over your time limit. And thank you ever so much for everybody's questions. And we have had some. And I think when we were thinking about putting this webinar on, we've kind of got to the point where we want to encourage the questions and the conversations and the engagement and participation. So thanks for the questions. I'll take them and I'll read them out. I'm not sure, Phil and Richard, are you there? I don't know whether you want to put your camera on at this stage. Some of them, I don't know how you're going to cut this, because some of them are quite technical and I don't know whether you'll know the answers. but I'll go for the technical ones first. And thank you, Callum Medway. We've had a couple of questions here. So older boilers use cast iron heat exchangers and steel flues. Will the 20% hydrogen cause excessive shaling due to the higher water content in the POCs? There's no prizes, Richard or Phil, but would either of you like to take that question?
I'll jump in on that one. So yeah, there's a number of trials going on at the moment with 20% hydrogen. The initial research is that it doesn't affect any of the appliances in any way, shape or form. But it is an ongoing trial, so that might be some of the feedback that it does affect them. But at the moment, no impact has been flagged up from the introduction of 20% hydrogen.
Okay, thank you. And following on from that, also from Callum, will adding 20% hydrogen cause issues in vertical pipework up buildings? Will the hydrogen separate and fill the pipework with pure hydrogen, causing potential light back?
Probably refer to my previous answer. Ongoing trial still. Not had any feedback about that. So we'll have to wait and see, but there's nothing to indicate that at the moment on the 20% blending.
Okay, thank you.
Probably
Another
important,
question.
Luce, just
Sorry,
before you
Phil.
leave that. No, I was just going to say it's probably important to reinforce the fact that the training we've been talking about this morning is for the 100% hydrogen, which obviously does create, it does require, it does produce more water content in the flue products and that sort of thing. But that's all the research and everything that's still ongoing to make sure that the 100% hydrogen is okay. That, as Richard says, the 20% blended stuff has been subject to a lot of research and hasn't caused any problems, and it hasn't got any impact at all on the competence requirements. People can do what they do with natural gas and they can carry on in the same way. So there is no extra requirement for blended hydrogen rollout. This one is for 100% hydrogen.
Okay, so this might follow on from that. So Ian Sturley, thank you for your question. Manufacturers are already testing new boilers at 20% hydrogen ready. Do you envisage a conversion programme for appliances? If so, will this form part of the required training? Do you want to take that, Rich?
Yeah, I'll take that one. So yeah, so 20% hydrogen, like we just said, there's no impact on boilers. Manufacturers, I think they've agreed to introduce hydrogen ready boilers, which is the first step. So that's 100% hydrogen ready from around about 2025, I believe. And that will require some form of conversion on the appliance when it does move over to hydrogen. So I think the plan is they will install boilers at the moment or in the future that can run on natural gas, but will be quite easy and straightforward to convert to 100% hydrogen. Training is a good issue on that one. It's a very good question because if we look at the current training in ACS, we train gas safety, but we don't actually train people how to strip down boilers, change components, etc. And maybe that's something that we need to look at in the future, but it will probably be manufacturer driven, as it's likely to be specific to their appliances.
Okay, thank you. Anything to add there, Phil?
No, that's dead right. Yeah.
Okay, so I think on that note, and this was a question that came in ahead of the webinar, but you just started to talk there in the answer to your question around the sort of training centres. But what assistance will training centres receive to adapt the current training and assessment installations?
Yeah, I can take that if you like. Yeah, the will, as I mentioned when I was speaking, that it's recognised that everybody's starting from a blank page here, so that there will need to be some help and advice, and also help with the costs, of course, because as I mentioned, there won't be a commercial market at the start. There won't be enough people going through to justify the investment that be required to set the centre up. So it is recognised across BAYS and SGN and ourselves that there will need to be assistance. I can't give you the exact numbers, obviously, because the process is at an early stage, but it will be up to SGN as the trial, the project people who are planning and rolling out the trial. They will be putting the engineers, selecting the engineers, putting the engineers through. They will determine where the location of the training will be, and it follows from that they will be helping alongside ourselves, energy utility skills, to make sure that the training provider and assessment centre, if there is only one needed at the start, which seems quite likely, that they are able to gear up and get ready for the trial. Because a trial, being a trial, worst case scenario, government policy might change. They might decide, well, we don't want to take it further. So we can't expect a lot of investment to go in and then, to get no further forward. But that's quite unlikely, I think, because the emphasis and rollout of hydrogen is high on everybody's agenda.
I'm just going to bring Phil Jenkins's question in because it seems quite appropriate at this stage of the conversation. So Phil's put, I would think that the industry might benefit from developing a common training pack for hydrogen with a limited scope for variation by individual training centres and CBs, given that this is a known and hopefully consistent approach to introducing hydrogen within the industry. Question mark.
First of all, I'd like to say thanks, Phil, for volunteering. No, it makes perfect sense. It's something that's not been done before. What we have got, if we look at the iGEM training specification, is we now have a standard specification that says all of these points must be covered during the training, which will be the same for hydrogen training. It's probably moving it on the next step, and I have no issue with it. I think it's a great idea. If we could get everybody to agree to actually, yeah, we'll all use this same training package, and there'll always be a little bit of poetic license, if you like, for people to add extra bits and embellish the training. But I think it's a great idea. Thanks, Phil.
I think that's probably where we'll end up in the early stages, if you like. But the problem with having a prescriptive training course from the start is that it immediately starts people thinking, well, we wouldn't do it like that. We'd do it slightly differently. We'd rather do it this way, that way, the other way. And we've learned from with other things, it's better to have a specification that says, well, this, do it any way you like as long as you meet this specification. And it does allow for innovation. I take Phil's point that at the start there won't be much scope for that, and that's why I'm saying really there'll need to be assistance and advice and guidance to the early training providers. But I think in the short term we'll end up with there won't be a vast range of different courses, and they will in the short term as well. There will be fairly frequently need to be updated, because if the current one is domestic because it's for the neighbourhood trial, before hardly any time at all, we're going to need to amend it and be able to enable non-domestic appliances. But it won't be all non-domestic appliances. It'll only be because, as many people will know, there's a whole raft of different categories and modules, ACS modules, that involve catering and large heating installations, etc. So we'll have to amend the training pack as we go forward, if you like. And what we're trying to do is to keep it all within the governance process that we've currently got, but enable providers as they go forward to do things slightly differently if it suits their the way their centre is set up, etc. There will be a common assessment module that everybody will need to use because that's the nature of the beast. But the training providers will have some latitude to be a bit flexible in terms of what they want to, how they want to deliver it. But the specification will be pretty robust in terms of what's got to be covered, how long it can take, etc., etc. So it's a sort of halfway house, really, which we're hoping will suit everybody. But it probably won't suit everybody. I've been around too long to think you could suit everybody.
I've actually invited Phil. I have invited you to chip in here if you want to. Have Phil and Richard managed to answer your question? I think so. He's obviously feeling shy this morning. But please put your hand up, Phil, if you did want to add anything to that. Oh, he's put yes, so we're all good. I'm not sure. And again, I'm doubting the sheer knowledge that you two have here. Based on my own, I wouldn't be able to answer this, but maybe you can. So thank you, Kevin, for your question. How much energy does it take to produce the hydrogen?
$1 million question. That wasn't the answer, $1 million, by the way.
No, I
know. I've got no idea whatsoever, but it does raise an interesting question about where the hydrogen is going to be introduced into the network. Not for the trial, that's fairly straightforward. It's small scale, it's in one location, etc. But if you think about the current terminals that we have dotted around the country and the way in which the gas is introduced into the network, you know, large pipes from north of Scotland, etc., plus all the others. Clearly, if you're going to produce the volume of hydrogen that we would need if we went for a national conversion, that really, I don't think, lends itself to the same distribution transmission model that we've got now. So however much energy it takes to produce the hydrogen, it's more interesting question for me is, okay, when you've produced it, can you produce enough volume in the right locations to introduce it into the network? So along with your question, Kevin, as how much energy does it take, which I can't answer that, I'm afraid, but is a lot of other questions which we are looking at and working with others to address is, well, what sort of network of transmission and distribution are we going to need, as well as the work we're doing on the downstream stuff for gas safe registered people. It's a completely different distribution model, it seems to me, that's likely. So
Kevin's
there's a lot
also
of
added, Phil, is it going to be cost effective?
I don't know. I mean, that's the intention, of course, that it's going to be cost effective, and over time we will get a return on the investment, and we won't be damaging contributing to the climate change, etc. I don't suppose we'd be doing this if it wasn't for the climate change requirements and the commitments for 2050, because that's just where we are.
Thanks, Phil. Phil's kind of put into the chat a response to, is it going to be more cost effective? It might not differ too much from the energy cost of producing electricity from the various sources we use now and going forward. Perhaps in the future, the energy needed to produce gas might become the same as electricity.
Yeah, I think that's a reasonable scenario, but and it's undoubtedly expensive, but you could even say very expensive. But the alternative to doing this with the gas industry is to go all electric, and you hear that people trot out there, well, we could go all electric, but of course that comes with an enormous cost as well, because the transmission of electricity, the system we currently have couldn't deliver that requirement without rewiring the country, which wouldn't be a cheap prospect either, and leave all those pipe in the ground redundant. So that doesn't really seem like a good way of using the assets either. But there's people paid a far more than I am to work those things out as to whether it's cost effective or not. I guess we'll all find out in due course.
Thank you. One more question in the chat. Well, I think there's some more coming through now that I missed earlier. Do you know if the existing smart meters are hydrogen ready?
No, they're not. They'll all be the metering will all be changed over. I understand that the manufacturers are producing meters now that can work on either, so you can sort of make some changes to the actual metering that adjust the flow and all that, and it'll work on both. But as far as I know, I don't know whether they're smart meters or not, but the existing smart meters, that natural gas smart meters, won't be able to be converted. They'll have to be replaced. That's my understanding, certainly for the trials anyway.
Yeah, I think I've seen on that, Phil, that the new hydrogen meters will need to be SMETS 2, which
Right.
is the
Okay.
latest version.
So yeah. So
yeah.
that's good. So yeah, but the existing ones, no.
Okay, thank you. So at this point, I think I've covered off all the questions in the chat. We have got a little bit of extra time. So if there is anybody that's still on the call that has any other questions, oh, here we go. So it's okay, Chris, don't worry. So a question from Chris Buck, who missed the start of the call. What are the timings for the 20% mix rollout?
So I know on that one, there was a trial at Keele University. There's Winlayton is the latest area that I believe might already be on 20%. And I've seen a few other posts on LinkedIn about other areas that are moving to 20% quite quickly. Don't know the exact rollout of that, but Chris, we were saying earlier that as far as the engineers are concerned, there's no further training required for the 20% mix, and we're not aware of any impact on appliances. So it should just be a seamless transition for the customer and the engineer, that they wouldn't even know if they're working on or using an area with 20% blend.
Hopefully that's answered your question, Chris. I think so. We'll take it. Yes.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Yeah, thanks.
So it looks like there's no more questions in the chat. And at this point, I'd like to thank you both. Thank you very much, Phil. Thanks, Richard, for answering some of those questions. We are going to be running another webinar in March to cover some of the points we think it would be valuable to expand upon from today. I think we've answered most of your questions. Like I said at the start, this webinar has been recorded, and I believe you will be automatically sent a copy of the recording. One last thing, if you would like to get involved in any of the activities that we've talked about today or have any further questions, please don't hesitate to contact me. My details are there, and that picture. We need to get a new picture, I think. But yes, my details are on the screen in front of you. All that's left to say is thanks ever so much for joining.
Sorry, Luce, we just got one more question. Got one more question has come in from Mark Lewis.
Thanks, Hawkeye. Mark Lewis, I can't actually read it, I'm afraid.
Yeah, what impact will it have on CPI? So I'm assuming combustion performance analysis. Yet to be determined, Mark. So clearly there'll be no CO within the products of combustion. But it begs the question, how will we measure the efficiency of the appliance? Personally, I'm awaiting the research on that one, Mark, to see what the impact will be. But I think we will need to do something to confirm that we have complete combustion going on. But I don't know what that looks like yet. So probably not that helpful, Mark, but watch this space, I think, on that one.
Yeah, I got nothing to add to that. That's right. There will I mentioned earlier on, there will need to be different analyzers, different equipment used for analyzing. But as I understand it, the only thing you can really analyze for is oxygen. So whether there'll be some technical way of determining, what you're looking for, whether the appliance is satisfactorily completely combusting, as it needs to, etc. Then, as Richard says, there is significant research going on, particularly with space heaters, fires, and to determine that. I think boilers they've been pretty well researched, and obviously with the most boilers, well, all boilers now being fan flued or isolated from the properties, no open flues or anything like that, then it's less of an issue, I think. But space heaters, definitely it is an issue, as is the condensate and stuff, all those sort of questions, in using space heaters in brick built chimneys and all that's different from a nice flue in a laboratory sort of thing. So this is work that is currently going on, and BEIS have commissioned a number of research projects from a whole range of different organizations who've got the capacity to do that research. And that's what I referred to a bit earlier on, where the research is the start of the chain, if you like. And then once the research is done, the technical standards will need to be amended. There is an interim technical standard for hydrogen that was produced last year that will inevitably need to be tightened up and amended, because it contains some gaps. And then once the technical standards rather have been amended, then the training specification can be amended to align to that, and then the assessment module also. So all these things are in a sequence which depend on definitive answers as far as possible from the research. So we're all waiting on those outcomes, really. And it's perfectly possible that by the time we need to start the training, we may not have definitive answers to absolutely every question that we've asked. In that case, of course, then we will have to fall back on belt and braces, if you like, to make sure that people can operate safely. And then once those answers are forthcoming and those gaps have been filled, then the training specification and everything may have to be amended to suit. So it's not going to be a straightforward, thing that you've got a training spec, there it is, it's not going to change for 5 years or whatever. It may not last 5 months before it has to be amended and tweaked and all that. So it's an ongoing process, I think, and we're at the very start of it.
We've had a couple of late entrants based on the discussion that we're having, and I probably should have laboured the point that you guys just have around some of these technical questions. Obviously, we are part of a broader programme or piece of work, and there's a lot of interdependencies, and so there is a lot of research that has just recently been commissioned, and we're all kind of feeding in. BEIS are obviously leading on the overall programme, and we've all been commissioned to do chunks of it. We're obviously leading on the skills part, but the research is being done. But like Phil said, it might not be done on time. A couple of questions here. One from Andrew Jackson. Just to clarify, the 20% will not affect the current CPA readings or gas rate, flame picture, etc. Is the 20% distributed through the current gas meters?
Yeah, so it is using current gas meters. It doesn't affect the combustion performance readings. Flame picture is the same. Gas rate, I'm not aware of any changes. I can see Callum's comment saying that hydrogen would give a lower calorific value. Yeah, I would agree with that. I've not seen to what extent it lowers it, and I've not. So yeah, good question that about how much it has lowered by. But my understanding is there's no impact to customers or engineers on that.
Paying for less.
Paying for less. No
Oh,
comment.
don't know.
Couldn't
No
say
comment.
one way or the other, to be honest, Callum. Have a personal view, but I don't know. Is the honest answer.
I wouldn't think it could be significant, because that would be unacceptable, I think, if you were just going to say, well, you're getting less, but you've got to pay the same. I mean, at the rate the gas prices have gone up, you probably wouldn't notice anyway, size of your bill. So, but no, it's outside the scope really of what this project's looking at, because we're not really looking at 20% blend.
Is that okay, Callum? Looks like it.
Not if he's on 20% blended, it's not, no.
Thank you. So, I think with just a couple of minutes to spare, I would say we'll leave the questions there. Thank you again to everybody that joined the call. Thanks very much, Phil. Thank you very much, Richard. Obviously, if there is anything that you think of in the meantime and want to ask any questions, obviously my details are all over the screen. Also, there is a link on the screen to the Hydrogen Competency Framework report, which Phil alluded to earlier. Any more? I think that's it from me and from Energy and Utility Skills. And enjoy the rest of your day.